Welcome to the Code of Life. I'm Randine Neal. In sports, any leg up to help edge out the competition is welcome. In fact, diet, sleep, and supplements are key strategies that athletes have used for years to enhance their performance. And increasingly, genetics and genomics are playing a role, not just for elite athletes, but anyone who wants to up their game, give it 110%, and leave it all on the playing field. You get my drift. Dr. Ahmed Al-Sohemi is a professor of nutritional sciences at the University of Toronto. He's one of the world's top nutrigenomics researchers and the author of dozens of papers on the subject. Dr. Nancy Guest is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Toronto, a registered dietitian and a strength and conditioning coach. She was the head dietitian at both the Vancouver 2010 Olympics and the Toronto 2015 Pan Am Games and has worked with the Vancouver Canucks. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you very much.
All right, so how has genomics changed the game when it comes to sports? Is it able to help parents predict whether or not their kid is going to be the next Steve Nash or Sidney Crosby?
Unfortunately, no. And I know a lot of parents were excited several years ago when they thought that might be possible. But unfortunately, it's a complex journey getting to that elite level. Although we do have some opportunities in how we can help developing athletes change how they're eating and how they're training to align with their genetic profile. So we can help them along the way, but we don't have any secure future predictions for talent ID.
So explain where genomics and sports kind of collide and maybe an explanation of what nutrigenomics is.
Sure. Well, I mean, as Nancy mentioned, there was a lot of interest and excitement in the field of genomics. When the first draft sequence of the human genome was published, and it was thought that perhaps we might be able to make use of that information to identify those future elite athletes. And as it turned out, really the research hasn't quite panned out because, as Nancy mentioned, there's many factors that determine if an individual will reach that kind of elite level of performance. But what we have learned is really how we can work with our genetic makeup. And there are many genetic variants throughout the human genome. These are single letter alterations that can explain why some of us look and function differently from others. And by understanding these genetic variants, we're able to better understand how and why some individuals respond differently from others to the same foods, beverages, and supplements that they consume, not only for performance-related outcomes, but also for health and diseases, which has really been the focus of our research.
And so where is it really playing a big role right now when we're speaking about elite athletes, for example? Are you focusing on things like caffeine or things like iron and taking it really individual by individual? Where do you see it really making an impact?
So some of the research that we did, and I'll pass it on to Nancy in a moment, where we looked at how genetic differences in athletes can explain why some of them respond differently to things like caffeine. We've also looked at genes that influence a person's iron status and how that seems to relate to endurance performance. So again, Nancy led some of those research projects, and I'm sure can describe it in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, I'll just also speak to it, how it's used in the field. So as a sport dietitian and a researcher, I was really in a unique position to bridge that gap from the science to the practice. So I use genetic testing with my athletes, and this is sort of the concept is personalized nutrition. So based on an individual's genetic profile, I can provide dietary and some training recommendations that are going to align and match to that genetic profile. So this is not going to be the same dietary or fitness program for each individual, because I'm going to first be guided by their DNA. And then we add other layers of personalization such as their food preferences, their cooking skills, their goals. But basically, we can have that first step guided by an individual's DNA. And it really is remarkable how much we can gather as far as looking at now we're close to about 75 different genetic markers related to athletic performance, exercise performance, and related to nutrition and supplements. So we really have a lot to work with, whether it's an elite athlete or just a fitness enthusiast. So someone trying to run better in their local 10K, or athletes I have getting ready for the Tokyo Olympics.
So it's really kind of taking some of the guesswork away. The trial and error. Does this supplement work for me? Does this level of protein work for me? And being able to provide more precise recommendations for that athlete based on their genetic makeup. And that's really where the science has advanced considerably over the past several years.
And I can give you a few examples if you like, Randine, just more specifics. So my PhD project focused on caffeine, and working with athletes for almost 20 years now, I see that most athletes believe that taking caffeine is going to enhance their performance. So many athletes are using it as what we call an ergogenic aid or a performance enhancer. But what we see in the scientific literature is that the studies show not all athletes are benefiting, and we don't see that all studies show a benefit of caffeine. And we were really confused for several years, wondering what's going on? What is the difference between individuals that seem to respond and those that don't? And through my research, I identified genetic markers that can determine whether an athlete or anyone is likely to benefit from caffeine or not. And this isn't only related to performance, but also the risk of feeling anxious. So those feelings of anxiety are also affecting individuals and athletes. And then we have things like muscle damage. Some athletes are more at risk of severe muscle damage after heavy training. So maybe they need an extra day of rest. And we have to be on top of their protein intake, their antioxidant intake, their anti-inflammatory foods. So we can really be more precise with our nutrition guidance as opposed to, again, as Ahmed said, those generic recommendations.
What do you do with an athlete who has it in their mind that, that can of Coke as a recovery drink and the caffeine kick it gives them helps them immensely, but your nutrigenomic testing has shown that caffeine doesn't help them at all? How do you change the mindset? Do you have issues, especially with elite athletes who tend to be maybe some of them superstitious and have their set things of what works and what doesn't? How do you teach them to listen to what the science tells you?
Well, with the athletes I'm working with, of course, we have built a trusting relationship, but we do have to acknowledge that sometimes the science is involving more than the athlete would execute on their own, and that it's under very controlled conditions. So I do get my athletes to monitor their response and how caffeine is making them feel. And maybe what they believed in the past may change now that they acknowledge that their DNA is saying something different. But certainly we combine the strategies of what the athlete is feeling, how they're performing out in the real world, as well as what we're finding with our genetic research. So I think it's important to have that combination. But certainly I have changed many minds by athletes acknowledging that maybe they have that placebo effect going on. And when they try training without caffeine, we see that they're actually performing better, which is very shocking to a lot of athletes, but they're relieved. They don't have to worry about caffeine and where to get it at the beginning of the race, what form to take it in, is it safe and not contaminated potentially with positive doping substances. So I think one thing about getting a competitive edge from your genetics, from your own personal DNA, is that it's safe and it's effective. And so we don't have to worry about some of those dangerous supplements, because we know not only athletes, but the general public is always looking for that competitive edge. And they're going to take risks with supplements in hopes that it's going to help them, whether it's fat loss, improved energy, improved endurance. So I think that's one of the benefits is I'm giving people an advantage that's safe and effective and something that's obviously very personal to them.
And it seems like the more studies and papers you do, it really shows how individual we all are in how we react to different supplements or food products. And Ahmed, I know you did a study on iron levels, which is also a big deal, not just for elite athletes, but all athletes in general. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we've known for a long time, of course, that optimal iron status is necessary for an athlete to perform their best, particularly when it comes to endurance type sports. And so what we did was we looked at individuals who have a particular form of a gene that increases the likelihood of them having greater iron stores. And we found that those individuals actually performed much better in a 10 kilometer cycling time trial. They also happen to have greater VO2 max, which is an indicator of oxygen carrying capacity. So this is what we call kind of a natural experiment without actually having to administer a substance. We look at people's genetics and how that impacts their tissue stores and blood levels of iron, which obviously affects their oxygen carrying capacity. So what we've learned from that type of research involving genetics really reinforces the need for ensuring that an athlete, particularly an endurance athlete, is monitoring their iron levels and ensuring that if necessary, they are taking the right kind of supplement to really maximize their genetic potential for that particular sport.
And I'll just add to that that as sport dietitians and sport medicine physicians, we are really on top of that low iron status, and we're always trying to get athletes into that normal range. However, this data has shown us that maybe we should be striving for that mid range or even the upper level of that range. So these genes are telling us that having higher levels of iron in the system are conferring a performance advantage. And again, that's really important for that competitive edge. I don't want to just take my athlete out of deficiency. I want to get them in that upper level in order to optimize their performance. And as we say, help them reach their genetic potential.
I want to ask you both quickly about the weekend warriors. You know, the grandma who walks to the mailbox every day and tries to beat her time by a minute, or the people that get out on the trails or play hockey on the weekends with their buddies. How can what you study, how can we benefit from what you're doing?
So the test that we developed, that it's a 70 gene test that's offered through Nutrigenomics, looks at different categories and aspects of a person's diet. So there's a whole section on micronutrients, and that includes not only iron, but things like vitamin D, which we know is essential for all kinds of physiological processes. Things like vitamin C, which is important not just for heart health, but also for tissue recovery. So, you know, after collagen synthesis and things like that. So each individual, based on their genetics, will have a different requirement. So some people need to be more mindful of getting a little bit more vitamin D than the average person. So it really helps an individual understand what aspect of their diet they need to focus on for, again, not only optimizing their physical performance, but in some cases, mental performance, and of course, their overall health. And you want to obviously stave off those common forms of chronic disease, while also, you know, feeling good, feeling energized, and feeling strong.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that that a major aspect of this testing that I'm doing with the general public as well as athletes is body composition. So we do have some information that is going to help individuals achieve their optimal muscle mass, bone health, as well as lowering their body fat through more information surrounding their response to exercise, but also in response to certain dietary factors, such as saturated fats or total fat. So we can really dial into that individual and help them with their best eating pattern that's going to really optimize health, body composition, as well as physical and mental performance. So really, we're sort of addressing everything with this genetic testing. And we have tests that are more focused on the health and wellness population, those focused on athletic performance, those that want their report in a plant-based or vegan option. So to have those recommendations in plant form. And that, of course, has been really popular.
Last question for both of you. Have you both tested yourselves? And was there anything that you learned about your own genomics that surprised you and changed the way that you train or eat?
Sure. So, I mean, I've, of course, tested not only myself, but my wife and kids. And so I used to have my own sample as a positive control in all our experiments, but through our 70 gene test. And one of the things for me was that I learned that I'm a slow metabolizer of caffeine. And I actually switched to drinking decaf. And initially, I thought that it was going to be quite challenging, but it didn't really affect me that much. I felt a little bit sluggish, for a couple of days. But we do know that some people do experience severe withdrawal. And that's partly also dependent on a person's genetics. So for those individuals who discover that they need to limit their intake of caffeine, a suggestion is to kind of do it gradually by decreasing the number of cups and then perhaps doing, half calf, half decaf. My wife is lucky. She is a fast metabolizer. So we actually have two different coffee makers at home. And so she makes her regular coffee and I make my decaf. But other things in terms of our genetics, and it speaks to this because, as a family, we eat together. We don't have all 4 separate meals. But for a family member who might need to increase their protein intake, it's a matter of them just having more of that, a greater serving of, kind of a protein containing dish, and perhaps a little bit less of, predominantly carbohydrate aspect. So, a little more chicken, a little less rice, as an example. So it is something that does fit in with kind of a family unit. And it's not really about revolutionizing and turning, our diets upside down. It's really more evolutionary and just kind of nudging us. So, do we need to have a little bit more vitamin D and perhaps a little less sodium based on our genetics? And that's really where I think the opportunities lie for this field.
Yeah. So my experience a little bit different. So as a dietitian, of course, I'm interested in ensuring I'm getting all the nutrients, and I'm a food person, obviously, by profession, and I have suffered traditionally with my blood work over several years that I do have low vitamin D and low iron. And it isn't until I'm really addressing it with supplementation that my levels get into that optimal range. So for me, that was just reinforced by my genetics, knowing that I do have a genetic risk for low iron and low vitamin D. So this has sort of further reinforced my habits to take those supplements. And of course, we can't really get enough vitamin D from general diet, and I am a vegan, so my options are really sunlight and supplementation. Another factor for me was, again, being a dietitian and seeing how many of my clients want to try the high-fat diets. Twice, I did sort of stick to a very strict high-fat diet and found actually that I gained weight, even though it was energy controlled. And interestingly, my genetics showed that I am likely to have difficulty losing body fat or have a risk of gaining body fat if I have a diet high in saturated fats. And it's very difficult to follow a high fat diet without those animal fats. So that was very interesting to me. Again, reinforcing that I should look for my healthy carbohydrates, my lower fat intake, and that's optimal for helping my body composition. And I have also had several athletes with that same dilemma, trying to cut out carbs, and it hasn't worked for them. And we look at their genetics, and then they're motivated to sort of get back to fueling up with carbohydrates and watching their fat intake. And that's resulted in them performing better, feeling better, and getting leaner.
I think this has been fascinating. We are out of time. It feels like what you are studying really is just the tip of the iceberg. And we are, all of us, one day, hopefully going to live up to our genetic potential. So thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Ahmed, very much.
Thanks, Randine. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Randine. It's been a pleasure.